My new housekeeper was on top of me when I woke up. You won't expect what followed. Scott Damon's eyes snapped open as his consciousness registered an unfamiliar weight pressing against his chest. The morning sunlight filtering through his bedroom window illuminated a sight that made his heart skip several beats. His new alien housekeeper, Lyanna, was sprawled across his naked body, her lavender skin gleaming in the golden rays. "What the actual fuck?" he whispered, his mind racing to process the situation. Her smooth bald head, with its delicate crest, rested just below his chin, her warm breath tickling his chest. The contrast between her exotic alien features and very human-like curves created a surreal tableau that left him momentarily paralyzed. His slight movement caused Lyanna's large sapphire eyes to flutter open. For a brief moment, they stared at each other in mutual shock before she gracefully rolled off him, her movements fluid despite her obvious embarrassment. "By the stars, Mr. Damon, I must apologize for startling you," she exclaimed, her melodious voice carrying notes of genuine distress. "And this is entirely my fault. I should have explained my species' customs more thoroughly when I accepted this position." Scott sat up, hastily pulling the sheet around his waist while trying to maintain his composure. "Lyanna, I'm going to need one hell of an explanation for this situation." She perched on the edge of the bed, seemingly unaware of her own nudity. "You see, my people, the Etheri are communal sleepers. We share body heat to conserve energy. It's deeply ingrained in our biology and culture. And after finishing my evening duties, I noticed your sleeping form and, well, my instincts took over." She paused, her crest flushing a deeper shade of purple. "I should have realized humans might view this differently." "You think?" Scott ran a hand through his tousled brown hair, fighting to keep his eyes focused on her face. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, he couldn't help but notice how the morning light played across her exotic features, highlighting the delicate patterns on her crest. "I must admit," Lyanna continued, a hint of mischief creeping into her voice, "humans generate an impressive amount of body heat. It's quite intoxicating." She shifted slightly, and Scott found himself increasingly aware of their state of undress. "Look," he said, trying to maintain a professional tone despite the circumstances, "I appreciate the cultural explanation, but on Earth, this kind of situation usually implies different intentions." Lyanna's crest rippled in what he was beginning to recognize as curiosity. "Different intentions? Oh." Her eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You mean mating customs? How fascinating. In my culture, we have very specific rituals for that. This was purely for warmth, I assure you." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though I must say, your physiological response suggests humans might combine the two concepts." Scott felt his face grow hot. "Jesus, Lyanna, you can't just... we need to establish some boundaries here." "Of course," she agreed, finally seeming to notice her state of undress. She gracefully retrieved her uniform from where it was neatly folded on a nearby chair. "Although I must admit, this has been the most comfortable rest I've had since arriving on Earth." As she dressed, Scott couldn't help but admire her fluid movements. He'd hired her through the Interstellar Domestic Services Agency, impressed by her references and the agency's reputation. Now he wondered if he should have asked more questions about potential cultural differences. "Perhaps," Lyanna suggested, now fully dressed but still looking somewhat flushed, "we could discuss these cultural differences over breakfast. I've been practicing human cooking techniques, and I'd very much like your opinion on my attempts at something called pancakes." Scott couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. "Pancakes sound great, but maybe we should establish some ground rules first. Rule number 1, clothing is mandatory outside of private quarters." "Noted," Lyanna said with a playful smile. "Though I must point out, Mr. Damon, you're still quite naked yourself." "Right," Scott coughed, suddenly very aware of his situation. "How about you start on those pancakes while I get dressed?" "As you wish," she replied, heading for the door. At the threshold, she paused and looked back with an expression he couldn't quite read. "And Mr. Damon, despite the cultural misunderstanding, I hope this hasn't made things awkward between us." "No more awkward than finding my alien housekeeper using me as a body pillow," Scott replied with a wry smile. "And please, call me Scott. After this morning, I think we're past formalities." Lyanna's crest rippled in what appeared to be pleasure. "Scott," she said, testing the name on her tongue. "Very well. Though I should warn you, My species forms strong emotional bonds through physical proximity. You might find me becoming rather attached." Before Scott could process the implications of that statement, she gracefully slipped out the door, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the lingering warmth where her body had pressed against his. "Fuck me," he muttered, falling back onto his pillows. "What have I gotten myself into?" 20 minutes later, Scott entered his kitchen, now properly dressed in casual weekend wear. The sight that greeted him nearly stopped him in his tracks. Lyanna moved through the space with practiced ease, her uniform hugging her curves as she expertly flipped pancakes. The domestic scene felt surprisingly natural, despite the morning's bizarre start. "I hope you like blueberries," she said without turning around. "Your dietary profile indicated a preference for them, and I found some in your stasis unit, refrigerator." "You read my dietary profile?" Scott asked, sliding onto a bar stool at the kitchen counter. "Of course, Joe. The agency provided extensive documentation about your preferences and habits." She placed a plate of perfectly golden pancakes in front of him, though they failed to mention humans' aversion to communal sleeping arrangements. "Probably because most humans don't typically share beds with strangers," Scott said, taking a bite of pancake. His eyes widened in surprise. "Holy shit, these are amazing!" Lyanna's crest flushed with pleasure. "I'm glad you approve. I've been studying human cuisine extensively, though I must admit, my interest in human culture extends far beyond just your food." The way she said it made Scott pause mid-bite. "Oh, indeed." She leaned against the counter, those striking blue eyes fixed on him. "For instance, I find human mating rituals fascinating. The complex dance of attraction, the subtle signals, the building of tension." She tilted her head. "Am I making you uncomfortable?" "Not uncomfortable exactly," Scott managed, suddenly very aware of how the morning light made her lavender skin shimmer. "Just surprised. The agency didn't mention you'd be so forward," Lyanna suggested with a small smile. "My species believes in direct communication, especially regarding matters of attraction. And you, Scott Damon, are quite attractive." Scott nearly choked on his coffee. "Look, Lyanna, you're gorgeous. You're very... That is..." He took a deep breath. "We need to maintain professional boundaries." "Of course," she agreed, though her crests rippled in what he was beginning to recognize as amusement. "Though I should mention that my contract includes a clause about potential romantic relationships between employer and employee. The agency is quite progressive about interspecies relations." "They actually put that in the contract?" "Page 47, subsection C," Lyanna confirmed. "I can quote it verbatim if you'd like." Scott couldn't help but laugh. "You really are something else, aren't you?" "I'll take that as a compliment," she said, beginning to clean up the kitchen. "Now, shall we discuss the rest of today's schedule? I believe you mentioned wanting the living space reorganized?" "Right, work," Scott said, grateful for the change of subject. Though maybe we should start with a thorough review of Earth customs regarding personal space." "An excellent suggestion," Lyanna agreed, "though I hope you'll be equally interested in learning about Etheri customs. Cultural exchange works both ways after all." The way she smiled at him suggested this was going to be a very interesting cultural exchange indeed. The following week proved to be an education in interspecies relations that no amount of agency briefings could have prepared Scott for. Living with Lyanna was like trying to waltz in zero gravity. Theoretically possible, but requiring constant adaptation and a healthy sense of humor. Scott," Lyanna's melodious voice called from his home office doorway, "I believe we need to discuss the concept of personal space again." She stood there holding what appeared to be his entire collection of underwear. He nearly spat out his coffee. "Why are you holding those?" "I was organizing your clothing storage units according to Etheri efficiency standards," she explained, her crest rippling with what he now recognized as professional pride. "But I noticed you became quite flustered yesterday when I attempted to discuss your garment preferences during dinner. Because normal human housekeepers don't usually ask about their employer's boxer brief preferences while serving pasta," Scott replied, trying to maintain his composure. Lyanna's head tilted thoughtfully. "Fascinating. So humans compartmentalize discussions about intimate garments, even though they serve essential functions. It's complicated." Scott ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Liana had noticed he made when flustered. Look, how about we establish some basic guidelines, like knocking before entering private spaces? But I thought we'd move past such formalities after our morning encounter last week. Her blue eyes sparkled with mischief. Besides, my species believes that sharing living space creates an intimate bond that transcends physical boundaries. That's exactly what we need to discuss, Scott said, standing up from his desk. Your cultural perspectives are fascinating, but... Oh, your heart rate just increased, Liana interrupted, her crest perking up with interest. Is it because I mentioned intimacy or because I'm still holding your undergarments? Scott fought back a laugh. Probably both. And how can you tell my heart rate changed? Etheri are naturally empathic, she explained, finally setting down the stack of clothes. We can sense physiological changes in those we're bonded with. And since our sleeping encounter, I've developed quite a strong connection to your biological rhythms. Wait, we're bonded? Scott felt his heart rate spike again. Indeed, though not in the permanent mating sense, she hastened to add, moving closer to him. More like a preliminary attachment. For instance, I can tell that despite your protests about personal space, you find our proximity quite stimulating. Scott stepped back, bumping into his desk. Liana, your pupils are dilating, she observed with scientific interest, and your skin temperature is elevating. Humans display such fascinating physiological responses to attraction. We need boundaries, Scott managed, though he couldn't help noticing how the sunlight through the window created mesmerizing patterns on her lavender skin. Of course, she agreed, taking a deliberate step back. I've been studying human courtship rituals. They seem unnecessarily complex, but I'm willing to learn. For instance, I understand that sharing meals is considered a bonding activity. Yes, but excellent. I've prepared lunch according to traditional human dating protocols. I believe it's called a picnic. Scott blinked. When did you have time to... While you were working. I've laid everything out in the garden. I even found a traditional woven basket in your storage unit. Her crest rippled with excitement. I've also prepared several topics for conversation that don't involve undergarments or sleeping arrangements. Despite himself, Scott laughed. You're impossible to resist, you know that? Actually, I calculated a 73.8% probability that you would agree to the picnic, she said with a satisfied smile. Your behavioral patterns suggest a strong appreciation for both good food and direct honesty. You've been analyzing my behavioral patterns? Of course. How else could I optimize our potential compatibility? She moved toward the door with fluid grace. Now, shall we proceed to the garden? I've prepared something humans call finger foods, though I'm quite curious about why you limit consumption to just one appendage. Following her into the garden, Scott found himself marveling at the scene before him. Liana had transformed his modest backyard into something out of a romantic comedy, complete with a checkered blanket, wicker basket, and what appeared to be an impressive spread of carefully prepared snacks. I noticed you have a preference for spicy flavors, she said, gracefully settling onto the blanket. So I've incorporated various earth peppers into our traditional Etheri recipes. I believe fusion cuisine is considered quite sophisticated among humans. Scott sat down beside her, maintaining what he hoped was a professional distance. This is incredible, Liana. But you know this isn't part of your regular duties, right? Oh, I'm well aware, she replied, her crest flushing slightly. Consider this personal research into human courtship rituals. For instance, I understand that feeding potential mates is a common practice across many Earth cultures. Potential mates? Scott nearly choked on the appetizer she'd just handed him. Is that too forward? The cultural guidelines provided by the agency were somewhat unclear about the appropriate timeline for expressing mating interest. She leaned forward, her large blue eyes intense. Though I must say, your physiological responses suggest mutual attraction. It's not that simple, Scott began, though he found his resolve weakening as she gracefully poured 2 glasses of wine. There are professional considerations, cultural differences, all fascinating challenges to overcome, Liana agreed cheerfully. Did you know that Etheri relationships typically begin with a period of mutual service? We believe that caring for another's needs creates the strongest bonds. Is that why you've been such a thorough housekeeper? Partially, she admitted, though I must confess, watching you react to my domestic efforts has been quite entertaining. Humans have such expressive faces, particularly when they find their clothing rearranged according to alien organizational systems. Scott couldn't help but laugh. "So you've been deliberately pushing my buttons?" "Studying your responses," she corrected with a playful smile. "For instance, I've noticed that despite your insistence on professional boundaries, you watch me when you think I'm not looking." Scott felt his face grow hot. "No need for embarrassment. I find your attention quite flattering, and reciprocal observation is a key component of etheric courtship." Her crest rippled in what he was beginning to recognize as pleasure. "For example, I've observed that you have a fascinating habit of running your hand through your hair when nervous, like you're doing right now." Scott quickly dropped his hand. "You're very observant. Indeed, I've also noticed that despite your protests about maintaining distance, you've moved approximately 15.3 centimeters closer to me since sitting down." Looking down, Scott realized she was right. "You really do analyze everything, don't you?" "It's part of my nature," she said, reaching out to adjust his collar with careful fingers. "Just as it's part of your nature to respond to my touch with elevated heart rate and dilated pupils." "Liana," Scott caught her hand, meaning to move it away, but finding himself holding it instead. "This is complicated. Only because humans make it so," she replied softly. "My people believe in acknowledging attraction openly and allowing it to develop naturally. We don't fight our instincts, we honor them." "And what are your instincts telling you now?" Her crest rippled with emotion. "That despite your species' complex social rules, you feel this connection as strongly as I do. That your insistence on professional boundaries is at odds with your biological responses, and that you're about to kiss me." "Am I that predictable?" Scott asked, already leaning closer. "No," she whispered, her breath warm against his lips. "You're wonderfully, fascinatingly human, and that's exactly why I find you so irresistible." 2 weeks after their garden picnic, Scott found himself participating in what Liana called the ritual of shared essence, which primarily involved him sitting cross-legged on his living room floor while she burned sweet-smelling alien incense and traced intricate patterns on his bare chest with shimmering lavender powder. "So this is a traditional etheric courtship ritual?" he asked, trying to remain still as her delicate fingers drew elaborate swirls across his skin. "Indeed," Liana replied, her crests glowing softly in the dimmed light. "The patterns represent the intertwining of life forces. Among my people, this is considered a deeply intimate gesture." Her blue eyes met his with characteristic directness. "Though I notice your heart rate suggests you find it intimate in other ways as well." Scott cleared his throat. "You can't blame me. You're literally painting me with glowing alien powder while wearing that. What did you call it?" "A bonding robe," she said, adjusting the diaphanous garment that seemed to float around her curves like morning mist. "Traditional etheric ceremonial wear. Though I notice you approve of how it complements my form. You're getting better at human understatement," he chuckled. "And you're getting better at etheric directness," she countered, leaning closer to add another pattern. "Your physiological responses are quite encouraging." The past weeks had been a whirlwind of cultural exchange, with each day bringing new discoveries about each other's species. Liana had introduced him to various etheric customs, from their elaborate greeting rituals to their fascinating perspectives on pair bonding. In return, Scott had been teaching her about human traditions, though her interpretations often led to endearingly awkward situations. "Remember when you tried to make me breakfast in bed?" Scott smiled at the memory. Liana's crests rippled with amusement. "How was I to know humans typically wear sleepwear?" In my defense, the cultural database entry on breakfast in bed was rather vague. "I don't think any database could have prepared me for finding you in my kitchen wearing nothing but an apron." "The apron was a concession to human modesty," she pointed out, adding another swirl to his chest. "Though your reaction was quite gratifying." Their relationship had evolved naturally despite the cultural differences, or perhaps because of them. Liana's direct approach to attraction and intimacy had gradually worn down Scott's initial reservations, while her genuine fascination with human customs had led to countless endearing moments of discovery. "There," Liana said, sitting back to admire her work. "The patterns are complete. Now we begin the meditation phase." "Meditation? You didn't mention that part." "The ritual of shared essence requires both participants to achieve spiritual harmony," she explained, moving to sit behind him. Here, lean back against me. Scott complied, trying to ignore how the thin fabric of her robe did little to mask her body's warmth. And how exactly do we achieve this harmony? Through synchronized breathing and physical contact, she murmured, her breath tickling his ear. The powder I used contains trace elements that enhance empathic connection. You should begin feeling its effects soon. Is that safe for humans? He asked, though he was already noticing a pleasant tingling where she'd applied the powder. I consulted the interspecies medical database, she assured him. The effects are perfectly safe, though possibly more intense for humans. Your species has particularly receptive neural pathways. As if to prove her point, Scott felt a wave of sensation wash over him, not just physical but emotional. He could suddenly sense Lyanna's feelings, her affection, her desire, her genuine joy at sharing this ritual with him. That's wow, he managed as another wave of emotion flowed through him. The powder enhances natural empathic bonds, Lyanna explained, her voice taking on a husky quality. Among my people, it's used to deepen intimate connections between potential mates. Potential mates? Scott turned his head to look at her, finding her face inches from his own. Is that what we are? What would you call this? She asked, gesturing to their entwined position and the glowing patterns on his skin. Humans have such complex terminology for relationship stages. Among Etheri, it's simpler. We either feel the connection or we don't. And what do you feel? Her crest rippled with emotion. Everything. Your strength, your kindness, your passion, the way your body responds to my touch, the way your mind opens to new experiences despite your initial hesitation. You fascinate me, Scott Damon. The powder's effects were intensifying, making him hyper-aware of every point of contact between them. He could feel her heartbeat, her breathing, the subtle vibrations of her crest as they responded to her emotions. You know, he said, voice rough with feeling, humans have rituals for deepening connections too. Show me, she whispered. What followed was a beautiful blend of their cultures, human passion meeting Etheri grace in a dance as old as time itself. The glowing powder created trails of light as they moved together, their empathic connection making every touch, every sensation exponentially more intense. Later, as they lay tangled in sheets that now bore traces of luminescent lavender powder, Lyanna traced patterns on his chest again, this time just with her fingertips. I should inform you, she said, her voice carrying its usual mix of scientific precision and intimate warmth, that Etheri-human compatibility extends beyond the spiritual realm. We are, in fact, biologically compatible in ways that might lead to significant life changes. Scott propped himself up on an elbow. Are you saying what I think you're saying? If you're thinking I'm discussing the possibility of successful cross-species reproduction, then yes. Her crest rippled with what he now recognized as nervous excitement. It's rare but documented. The agency actually has quite extensive paperwork for such occurrences. Of course they do, Scott laughed, pulling her closer. You know, when I hired a housekeeper, I wasn't expecting any of this. Life rarely meets our expectations, she said wisely. Sometimes it exceeds them in the most wonderful ways. Scott stared at the holographic medical readout floating above Lyanna's abdomen, his mouth slightly agape. The Etheri doctor, a tall, distinguished-looking male with steel-gray skin and elaborate head crests, nodded with professional satisfaction. Congratulations, Dr. Theron announced, his crest rippling with what appeared to be scientific excitement. You're experiencing a perfectly healthy human Etheri pregnancy, and given the accelerated gestation period of our species, you should expect your son in approximately 6 Earth weeks. 6 weeks? Scott wheezed, gripping Lyanna's hand tighter. But we just found out yesterday. Lyanna's crest glowed with maternal pride. Etheri pregnancies are remarkably efficient, beloved. Our bodies don't waste time once genetic compatibility is established, which makes this case particularly fascinating, Dr. Theron added, adjusting his holographic instruments. The first documented human Etheri conception in this sector. I've already submitted a preliminary paper to the Interspecies Medical Journal. Before Scott could process this information, his home's AI system chimed. Incoming priority communication from the Etheri Central Network, tagged Family Emergency. Lyanna's crest suddenly paled. Oh, stars. That would be my parents. The holographic display shifted, revealing two elegant etheri faces. The female's crests were an iridescent pearl color, while the male's matched Lyanna's lavender hue. "Daughter!" the female exclaimed. "Our family's genetic monitors just registered a cross-species conception alert. We're already en route to Earth for the traditional blessing ceremony." "Mother, father," Lyanna managed, her crests flickering with nervous energy. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting you for at least..." "Nonsense," her father interrupted. "The first blood blessing must be performed before the third phase of gestation. We'll arrive in approximately 8 Earth hours. I trust your human mate is prepared for the trials?" Scott felt his throat go dry. "Trials?" "Oh yes," Lyanna's mother beamed. "The traditional tests of worthiness for any non-etheri who dares to merge bloodlines with our ancient houses. I do hope you've been studying our customs, young man." "He's been very dedicated to learning our ways," Lyanna assured them quickly. "Scott is remarkably adaptable." "Excellent," her father declared. "Then he should have no trouble with the ritual of ancestral combat or the ceremony of molecular harmony." Scott turned to Lyanna, panic rising in his chest. "The ritual of what now?" "Don't worry," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "The combat is mostly symbolic. Usually. "We'll see you soon, daughter," Lyanna's mother chirped. "And you, future son by binding, do try to survive the trials. We'd hate to have to find another father for our grandchild." The transmission ended, leaving an awkward silence broken only by Dr. Thurin's enthusiastic note-taking. "Fascinating," the doctor muttered. "Cross-cultural family dynamics during accelerated gestation periods. This case study gets better by the minute." Scott sank into a nearby chair. "Lyanna, sweetheart, remember when you said etheri culture was straightforward?" "Compared to humans, yes," she defended, her crests rippling apologetically. "Though I may have understated certain traditional aspects." "Like ritual combat with your father?" "It's really more of a dance," she assured him, "with energy blades." "Energy blades?" "Ceremonial ones. They only cause mild cellular disruption." She paused, noting his expression, "which our medical technology can easily repair." Dr. Theron looked up from his notes. "Actually, given the subject's hybrid pregnancy status, perhaps we should discuss the traditional post-combat regeneration protocols?" "Not helping, Doctor," Lyanna sighed. She moved to kneel before Scott, taking his hands in hers. "My love, I know this seems overwhelming, but these traditions are important to my family. They're how we welcome new bloodlines into our ancient houses. By testing if they can survive energy blade combat, by ensuring they're strong enough to protect and nurture the next generation," she corrected, "my people believe that true worth is proven through action, not words." Scott took a deep breath, looking into those mesmerizing blue eyes that had captured his heart from day one. "And what happens if I fail these trials?" "Then we'll face exile together," she said simply, "because I'm not leaving you, regardless of ancient traditions." Her crest glowed with such pure love that Scott felt his fears begin to melt away. "Well, when you put it that way, I guess I'd better start practicing my energy blade techniques." "That's the spirit," Dr. Theron chimed in cheerfully. "Though perhaps we should discuss the proper medical procedures for energy blade injuries first, just as a precaution." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Lyanna attempted to crash course Scott through the basics of etheri formal customs, while Dr. Theron insisted on running additional scans of their developing child. "The fetal crests are already showing signs of human influence," the doctor noted excitedly. "See how they form a unique pattern? And the genetic markers suggest he'll inherit both etheri empathic abilities and human adaptive traits. Truly remarkable." "That's fascinating, Doctor," Scott said distractedly, trying to memorize the 17 traditional greeting gestures Lyanna was teaching him. "But maybe we could focus on keeping his father alive long enough to see him." "Oh, the survival rate for these trials is actually quite reasonable," Dr. Theron assured him. "Almost 60%. 60? Lyanna!" "He's exaggerating," she said quickly. "It's at least 75%. And my father hasn't seriously injured a potential mate candidate in at least 3 cycles?" "Seriously injured? Minor cellular disruption hardly counts," she insisted. "Now let's practice the stance of respectful submission again. Remember, keep your left foot exactly 3 degrees offset from your center of gravity." As Scott attempted to master the intricate physical protocols of ethereal formal greeting, he couldn't help but marvel at how his life had changed. Just weeks ago, his biggest concern had been whether his new alien housekeeper would properly sort his laundry. Now he was preparing to face ritual combat while expecting a hybrid child. "You know," he said during a brief break, watching Lyanna's crests glow with maternal radiance as she absently stroked her still flat stomach. "When you first showed up naked on top of me that morning, I never imagined it would lead to this." Her crest rippled with amusement. "Disappointed?" "Terrified," he admitted, "but also complete. Like everything in my life was just preparation for meeting you." "That's very poetic," she observed. "Perhaps you should save such sentiments for the ritual of verbal devotion? It's traditionally performed after the combat trial, assuming you're still conscious." "Not helping, my love." "Sorry," she grinned, not looking sorry at all, "but your anxiety is actually quite adorable. Your pheromones get this spicy note when you're nervous." Speaking of pheromones," Dr. Theron interrupted, "these readings are fascinating. The pregnancy appears to be enhancing your natural empathic bond. Have you noticed any unusual shared sensations or emotional transference?" Before they could answer, the House HFY chimed again. "Incoming vessel detected in Earth orbit. Etheri registry matches provided credentials. Estimated arrival at designated landing zone. 15 minutes. Scott felt his heart rate spike. 15 minutes? But you said 8 hours. "Ah," Lyanna said sheepishly. "I may have forgotten to mention that Etheri ships are capable of temporal compression during emergency family situations." "Temporal compression? You mean time travel?" "More like selective acceleration through space-time," she explained. "It's perfectly safe, though it does tend to make humans a bit queasy." As if on cue, a sleek silver vessel appeared in the sky above their house, its hull shimming with chronometric energy. "Well," Scott said, straightening his spine and taking Lyanna's hand, "I guess it's time to meet the in-laws." "Remember," she whispered, squeezing his fingers, "no matter what happens in the trials, I love you. Our son loves you. We're family now, regardless of ancient traditions." "Speaking of family," Dr. Theron added helpfully, "I should mention that Etheri pregnancy hormones can sometimes cause unexpected energy surges during ceremonial combat." "Really not helping, Doctor." The ceremonial arena aboard the Etheri vessel glowed with bioluminescent light as Scott faced his soon-to-be father-in-law. High Counselor Thex's elaborate crest rippled with anticipation as he activated his ceremonial energy blade, its purple light casting ethereal shadows. "Ready yourself, Earth Son," Thex announced formally. "The trial of ancestral combat begins." Scott gripped his own blade, trying to remember Lyanna's hasty training. From the observation platform, he heard her mother, Lady Mira, whisper loudly, "His stance is all wrong. Are we certain he's worthy of our bloodline?" "Mother!" Lyanna protested, her own crests flickering with pregnancy-enhanced emotions. "Remember what happened during your own mate's trials?" "That was different," Lady Mira sniffed. "Your father at least knew the proper ceremonial salute." "Oh my!" The "oh my" came as Scott instinctively dodged Thex's first strike, moving with unexpected grace. Thanks to his empathic connection with Lyanna, he could sense the elder Etheri's movements before they happened. "Interesting," Thex commented, executing a complex pattern of strikes. "You've bonded deeply enough to share her battle sense. Most impressive for a human." "Well," Scott grunted, parrying another blow, "your daughter has a way of surprising people. Remember how we met?" "Ah, yes," Thex chuckled, his blade humming dangerously close to Scott's ear. "The inappropriate sleeping arrangement. Most shocking by human standards, I understand." "You could say that. Whoa!" Scott barely avoided a sweeping strike, though it worked out pretty well in the end. From her position, Lyanna suddenly doubled over, her crest glowing brilliantly. "Speaking of surprises, I believe my water just broke." All combat ceased immediately. "But you're not due for another 3 weeks!" Scott exclaimed, deactivating his blade. Apparently, Dr. Theron observed from his monitoring station, the emotional intensity of the combat trial has accelerated the final phase of gestation. "It's fascinating." "Less fascinating, more helping," Scott called, rushing to the Lyanna's side. "Wait!" Lady Mira intercepted him. "The trials aren't complete without the proper blessings." "Mother," Lyanna said through gritted teeth, her crest pulsing with contractions. "Your grandchild is coming now. Traditional protocols can wait." "Actually," Dr. Theron interjected cheerfully, "there is one ancient precedent for combining the birth ritual with the combat trials, though it hasn't been attempted in 7 centuries. "Explain quickly," Thex demanded, his paternal instincts overriding ceremonial requirements. "The ritual of unified creation," the doctor elaborated, "where the combat energy is channeled into supporting the birth process. It requires perfect synchronization between all family members." "Do it!" Lyanna gasped, grabbing Scott's hand. Through their bond, he felt a wave of both pain and determination. What followed was unlike anything in either human or etheri medical texts. As Lyanna labored, Scott and her parents formed a triangle around her, their energy blades creating a matrix of light. Dr. Theron directed them in channeling their combined energy to support the birth process. "Remarkable!" the doctor exclaimed, monitoring multiple holographic readouts. "The human's natural bioelectric field is amplifying the etheri energy patterns, and the baby's hybrid genetics are responding magnificently." "Less commentary, more delivering," Scott suggested, maintaining his position despite the strain. Through their empathic bond, he felt everything Lyanna experienced: her pain, her joy, her determination. Their connection had grown so strong that he could even sense their unborn son's consciousness, a bright spark of combined human and etheri energy. "The crests!" Lady Mira gasped suddenly. "Look at how they're forming." The baby's tiny crests were indeed unique, a perfect blend of etheri patterns with subtle variations that seemed almost human in nature. As the final moments approached, the ceremonial energy matrix pulsed in harmony with Lyanna's contractions. "One final push," Dr. Theron encouraged. "The combined energies are perfectly aligned." With a flash of bioluminescent light that temporarily blinded everyone in the chamber, their son entered the world. His first cry carried both human strength and etheri resonance. "By the ancient star," Thex breathed, deactivating his blade to approach the newborn. "He's perfect." The baby boy's skin was a pale ivory with subtle lavender undertones, his tiny crests already showing signs of both species characteristics. But it was his eyes that captured everyone's attention. Human-shaped, but with the intense blue of his mother's race. "Well done, Earth Son," Thex said formally, placing a hand on Scott's shoulder. "And you have proven yourself worthy not just through combat, but through your devotion to my daughter and grandson." "Does this mean we can skip the remaining trials?" Scott asked hopefully, cradling his son while supporting an exhausted but radiant Lyanna. "Skip them?" Lady Mira looked scandalized. "Certainly not, but we can adapt them to include the little one. After all, he is the first of a new bloodline." "The perfect blend of both worlds," Lyanna murmured, touching their son's tiny crests, "just like his father." "Speaking of blending worlds," Dr. Theron interrupted, still taking readings, "these genetic combinations are revolutionary. The way his human DNA has perfectly integrated with etheri traits. We could be looking at an entirely new chapter in interspecies relations." "Doctor," Scott said firmly, "can the scientific analysis wait? We're having a family moment here." Of course. Though I should mention that his unique genetic structure might affect traditional naming ceremonies." Actually," Lyanna said softly, "I was thinking we could call him Alexander. It means defender of humanity in Earth's ancient languages." "Alexander?" Scott tested the name, feeling his son's consciousness respond through their family bond. "It's perfect." "A strong name," Thex agreed, "though he'll need an etheri name as well for formal occasions. And we still have the ritual of molecular harmony to complete," Lady Mira added, "and the ceremony of genetic acknowledgement and..." "Perhaps," Lyanna suggested diplomatically, "we could take a brief rest first. Some of us did just give birth." Looking at his new family, his beautiful alien wife, their miraculous hybrid son, and his rather intimidating but well-meaning in-laws, Scott couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. "Something amusing, Earth Son?" Thex inquired. "Just thinking about how this all started," Scott explained, "with an alien housekeeper who didn't understand human sleeping customs. And now look at us. We're literally making history." "Indeed," Dr. Theron agreed enthusiastically. "The first documented human ethera family unit. The scientific papers alone will..." "Doctor," everyone said in unison. "Not now."